So if everyone from the waiting room is in, I will welcome you to this last session for the day. I'm Bridget Griffin-Foley. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jamie Medhurst to this conference. It's quite early in Wales, so we do appreciate him getting up, not just to speak, but he also attended the previous session. Jamie is a reader in film, television and media at Aberystwyth University. He's co-editor of the journal Media History, which many of you will know and possibly have published in. He's working on a number of books and projects, mainly about the BBC, and he's going to be speaking to us this afternoon or this morning his time on Wales in broadcasting history. So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Bore da, good morning, or prynhawn da, good afternoon. It's greetings from a rather damp and windy Aberystwyth, but it's great to be here. Talking about Wales in broadcasting history. So it'll be quite a broad overview in 20 minutes or so, but I put my email there. If anyone would like to follow up, afterwards, I know we'll have time for some questions or discussion, but if anyone wants to follow up anything in more detail afterwards, then by all means, drop me an email. It's also good. I think I'm right. I say we're in the Clem Lloyd room, which is of course a great Welsh name, or derived from the Welsh llwyd, which can mean grey, but also has connotations of wisdom and respect. Which, although I didn't know Clem Lloyd directly, clearly there was a lot of respect for his work, and it's good that Welsh connection today. I just thought I'd show you briefly Aberystwyth. It's not like this today. Here's the town of Aberystwyth on the top here. On the bottom, you can see the campus of the University of Aberystwyth. We've been there the university's been there since 1872, which predates any form, of course, of broadcasting in Wales. So, why is broadcasting important? I think this is a quote, and I have referenced it very poorly, I apologise, but it's from a book called Press, Politics and the Media in Wales by Professor Alun Jones, a Welsh historian, who talks about broadcasting in terms of the ideas, assumptions around the media and society and media and political life in Wales being carried over from one century to the other. The idea that in the right way, forms of communication could protect and maintain a sense of nationhood, protect particularly the integrity of the Welsh language, and the idea of the Welsh language being tied to that national identity will come up a couple of times in the paper. For those of you who I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Welsh language, it's one of the oldest languages, oldest European languages, with early manuscripts going back in Welsh to the 6th century, some of which actually are housed in the National Library of Wales here in Aberystwyth. It's spoken now by around let's see, around 21% of the population in Wales, and many institutions in Wales are fully bilingual. So it's very much a live language and a living language. And broadcasting, I think, ties into that in the sense of national identity, of language and culture and so on. But I referred in the title to an awkward area. And it's a phrase that Lord Hill, who was the Independent Television Authority chairman, used in 1967 when the ITV, Independent Television, licenses for the various parts of the UK were being rediscussed. And in fact, the Welsh incumbent Television Wales in the West lost out to Harlech Television, HTV. But in the course of, in his book, actually reflecting on that license process, he referred to Wales as an awkward area. Others have referred to Wales as a broadcaster's nightmare. There's a quote here from Richard Last, who wrote in 1970 in the Daily Telegraph that Wales and the West was a televisual Austria-Hungary. He says it's difficult not to see the Wales-West marriage as an artificial one, because, as I'll explain in a second, Wales very often has been tied in broadcasting terms to the west of England. Jeremy Potter, in his book on the history of independent, his volume on the history of independent broadcasting in the UK talks about a most intricate region in terms of engineering and cultural characteristics, and I think there's a lot tied in. I think a lot of factors which help explain why Wales is seen as an awkward area, because of transmitters, engineering, because of the geography, because of the culture, because of the language, and then broadcasters, which is why it's sometimes a broadcaster's nightmare. I found it difficult to satisfy that audience and the provision of a programme service. It was interesting earlier actually listening to Justine talk in the panel about the vertical history and drilling down, because most of what I have to say today, most of what I've written about comes, I think, from that institutional policy aspect. It's what's missing, I think, in a lot of Welsh broadcasting history is what the viewers, the drilling down, what the viewers and the listeners actually felt and thought. But it's something that I'm hoping that we'll be addressing. We're waiting to hear about a grant application, myself and a colleague in Swansea University, about doing a century of broadcasting in Wales, and it's something we're hoping to drill down and getting that audience perspective, which is missing a little bit. But that's, sorry, I digress. I'm off on a slight tangent there. I'll just give you a brief history. You can see why we're raising this issue of region or nation or awkward area, because broadcasting begins in Wales in earnest in 1923, on the 13th of February 1923. We know that the BBC itself, public service broadcasting, is celebrating 100 years next year, beginning from in London in 1922. But it's February 1923 that the BBC, the broadcasting company, opens its first station in Wales, 5WA, and there's a little plaque in 19 Castle Street in Cardiff commemorating that, and a picture there, I think, of a small orchestra that played on the opening day of broadcasting. What's interesting is that from those early days, that station in Cardiff served Wales and the west of England, so over the Bristol Channel, the Bristol Bath area, if you're familiar with that, Somerset, parts of Gloucestershire, maybe on the border between England and Wales, and that created from those very early days some tensions, particularly I think on the English side, if you like, English listeners who were complaining there were far too many Welsh hymns and far too many Welsh talks. What's interesting though is when you look at Welsh journals at the time and magazines, periodicals, you'll get exactly the opposite, saying there isn't enough Welsh material, Welsh interest and Welsh language material. So in a sense, I suppose, as the BBC say today, if you've got both sides complaining, then they must be doing something right. I'm not sure. But the other thing about the very early days of radio is within the BBC, these early days, pre-1930s, were very much, these were broadcasting companies that were very local to their own area and provided material drawn from that area or that region or that nation. When we get to 1930, we see John Reith, the BBC's Director General, imposing or introducing a regional scheme in conjunction with his chief engineers, where the UK is divided up into regions. Reith establishes a national programme, very much in his vision of the BBC uniting the whole of the UK, kind of social cement, bringing everyone together. So there's a national programme, but there's also a regional programme with UK regions established in Scotland, Northern Ireland, the North, the Midlands, and the West, which included Wales. So Wales is part of the West region, and in a sense is then tied to England, Wales and the West of England. What happens through the 1930s then is increasing pressure from a number of groups within Wales, from the University of Wales, which had been established. Actually, a kind of aside, I was thinking about this, funnily enough, about 5:30 this morning, a couple of hours ago. You have in Wales the establishment in 1893 of the university, the National University of Wales. In 1909, the National Library of Wales is established in Aberystwyth. Before that, I forgot the date, 1901, I beg your pardon, it's the National Museum of Wales established. So these national Welsh institutions are being established. And then in 1922-23, you have the BBC, this new medium coming along, which goes somehow against that a little bit, because here we have a British broadcasting, a national institution on a British level, not on a Welsh level. And there's a kind of tension there, I think, that comes to the fore in the 1930s when Reith imposes this regional scheme, ties Wales to the west of England. And as I was saying, the University of Wales, the Urdd, which is the Welsh League of Youth, a youth organisation established in 1922, putting pressure on the BBC to recognise Wales as a region, a broadcasting region in itself, but in doing so recognising Wales as a nation. And there's a wonderful wonderful articles in the Western Mail, the national newspaper of Wales at the time, from E.G. Bowen, who was a physicist in Aberystwyth, in a university actually, arguing that this is how you could create a Wales region and recognise Wales as a nation, just as the BBC had done in Scotland. But his ideas were dismissed. They were picked up, however, by a number of organisations, including the University of Wales, and eventually Reith, the BBC, climbs down and establishes a Welsh region in 1937 after a lot of protest and pressure. This is why people were concerned. This is going back to 1927. This is from a report by the Education Board of Wales, Welsh in Education and Life, looking at all aspects of education across Wales, but picking up on the BBC as being a serious menace to the life of the Welsh language. So here we see the Welsh language coming to the fore as that marker, I suppose, of the Welsh nation. Bearing in mind at this time, 1927, there were around close to 1 million speakers speaking Welsh. They were or were bilingual, I should say, not monoglot Welsh speakers, but were bilingual. And what the report said, these programs, these English programs, were coming into people's homes, into that domestic setting, into the living room. They were in a language that was alien to a number of households, i.e., where were the Welsh language programs that people could hear, could see themselves reflected, and so on. And what the fear was that this Anglicisation, I suppose, would unless it was recognised by the BBC, would damage Welsh life and Welsh language and culture. There was an interesting response to that by Ernest Appleton, the West Regional Director of the BBC, who basically said, well, Wales is part of the Commonwealth of Nations. The official language is English. I love this idea that if the Welsh extremists who desire to force their language on listeners would have their way, the official language would lose its grip. The idea that somehow English would somehow disappear is quite interesting. But that was the response of the BBC to that particular issue. And then came television. I put one step forward, two steps back, because the Welsh region was established in 1937. So you have that acknowledgement. It's still called a region, but there's acknowledgement of Wales as a unit, perhaps, and that divorcing it in some sense from the west of England. Television comes. The service was established in 1936, initially in London only. It closes during the Second World War. It comes back in 46, and gradually television then is spread across the UK. The BBC network develops. In 1949, the Sutton Coldfield transmitter opens. That's a transmitter just outside Birmingham, serving the Midlands. Of course, if you were wealthy enough to have a television set and you lived in the east of Wales, which borders with England, then you could pick up programs from that transmitter. It's not until 1952 that television, I suppose, really comes to Wales, when the Wenvo transmitter in the south of Wales opens. Actually, it doesn't. It comes to South Wales rather than the whole of Wales. But again, that transmitter, because transmitters don't respect national boundaries or any kind of boundaries, also includes the south of England. So Wales and the west. I'll just take one slide forward so you can see. This is announcing the opening. Television comes to Wales and the west, and Wales and the west is also the distinguished company from Wales and the west of England. This is from I think the Radio Times at the time. But I want to go back to the very humble beginnings. I'll mention this shortly when I finish, but I was fortunate enough to be involved in a project recently with David Hendy in the University of Sussex, looking at BBC Oral History Archive and Entertaining the Nation. And one of the sections in that I did was on Wales and Scotland. And in there are some wonderful interviews with people from the BBC in Wales at the time, just underlining how humble the beginnings of television in Wales were. So when television came to Wales, there were no television studios. The BBC had to adapt an old disused Welsh Methodist chapel in Cardiff, and there were presenters sitting on cement bags, and really humble beginnings. But also because there were no studios, they had to, if they wanted to broadcast a program from Wales, they had to use an outside broadcast van, which they also had to share with Bristol and or the west of England. So again, not only in transmitter terms but in resource terms, Wales was tied to the west of England. Not only that, a rival television service emerges in 1955, initially in London. Independent television, commercial television, comes to the UK, and in 1958, ITV's Television Wales and the West. Okay, so we're linking Wales and the west of England again, is launched from a St Hilary transmitter in south of Wales. The BBC, its interesting response to that is fascinating, because there's a lot of correspondence between Cardiff and London, between Wales and London. BBC Wales pleading, saying, give us more resources, give us and more programming time, give us money for Welsh language programming, because people are going to flock to the rival service unless we respond. In the 60s, then you have the Pilkington Committee, which looks at a whole range of broadcasting issues, but focuses on the nations, the BBC's nations, so Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and recommends that the BBC and ITV actually bolster or recognise the nations more within UK broadcasting. And so what we have in 1964 is BBC Cymru Wales, Cymru, the Welsh word for Wales, being launched as a semi-autonomous, I suppose, broadcasting service, providing 12 hours of programming specifically for Wales, 7 in the Welsh language and 5 in the English language. And it didn't always meet that target. Those hours were on a weekly basis, but for the first time you had that sense of television, particularly through television news, giving that sense of nation. There was news in Welsh and English for Wales as a nation that was separate from news that would be broadcast for Wales and the West. This kind of mash of news between two different countries. In 1965, the year after, then again, thanks to developments in technology and transmitters, an all Wales ITV commercial television service was launched. Okay, a brief word. Let's have a quick look at the time. Okay, I've got a few, well, maybe squeeze a minute or two left. Just to mention some of these things, I think these issues are going back to technology and the transmitters. There was spillover. The BBC's Sutton Coldfield transmitter, ITV in the Midlands and the North. So, funnily enough, the very first Welsh language television programme from commercial television comes from Granada, which is based in Manchester, because the signal from the Winter Hill transmitter went all across North Wales. And there's always this uneasy marriage, I think, between parts of Wales and parts of England. Sharing transmitters, ban Welsh telly was a campaign launched in the Bristol area, again, because when television came, as I said, serving Wales and the West, there were complaints that all these Welsh language programs were just getting in the way of people's enjoyment of the medium. And the location of and lack of transmitters as well in certain parts of rural mid Wales was fueling nationalist sentiment. I think that feeds in then in the 60s and the 70s to a wider nationalist movement, cultural and political nationalist movement that develops in Wales. There were impacts, of course, on program schedules and audiences when you're serving 2 languages, 2 audiences, 2 countries, 2 nations, then obviously those programs of interest to the minority of viewers or listeners are going to be pushed to unsociable hours in the schedule. And people as well, it's not just, I think, people in the west of England complaining about Welsh programs. There were non-Welsh speakers in the south of Wales particularly who would literally go up to their roofs and turn their aerials to avoid the Welsh language programming, to move the aerials away from the Wenvo transmitter to get to a Mendip transmitter on the other side of the Bristol Channel, because the Darren Welsh programmes were interrupting their enjoyment. And finally, I just want to come back to this quote. This is from evidence to the Pilkington Committee in 1960. Wales is entitled as a right to be treated as a nation and not a geographical region. And that, I suppose, that just crystallizes debates in broadcasting history in Wales from the 20s through to the 60s, and I'm sure it's been quite a gallop through that. I am going to give a bit of self-promotion. This is the link to the site of the Oral History Archive. I did 6 of the 9 sessions, and other colleagues contributed wonderful sections to this. But the one I wanted to do, as I say, was entertaining the nations, which looks particularly at Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. So by all means, go and have a browse through that. You'll get lost in wonderful clips and video and interviews and so on. Diolch yn fawr am wrando. Thank you very much for listening. I apologise, it's been a bit of a gallop, but I hope you enjoyed it. And over to you, Bridget, for fielding any questions and things for me.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I'm just going to begin this last session of the day by welcoming Dr. Hans-Ulrich Wagner from Hamburg, who has joined us for this session and the last session. So we're very lucky to have our Northern Hemisphere colleagues getting up early to join us today. And I think you should all have a sense of the value that Jamie has contributed to this conference by making us think a little bit more broadly about questions of place and the regions in media history and, beyond Australia. So we do have an opportunity for some questions or comments. I'll also keep an eye on the chat. And actually, I'll just say while you're gathering your thoughts, Jamie, I'm glad you gave some of your own work a plug. Entertaining the Nation was launched a few weeks ago, so that's another good reason to have you here, so that you can alert some of your Australian colleagues to that. Hopefully most of you here are familiar with some of the digital resources that have been emerging as a result of research centred on the centenary of the BBC in 2022. So Jamie, I know, has also written elsewhere on the 100 Voices that made the BBC site, and he's written specifically about the nations within the BBC. So I do urge you to have a look at that. And I think we also have Dr. Janine Baker here, who has been involved in some of that digital undertaking. Hi, Janine. Now we do have a few minutes for Janine. If you're trying to say something, unmute yourself.
I was just going to say I didn't have a question. I just want to say thank you very much, and to Jamie. And I thought it was really fascinating, especially, after listening to your paper, Bridget, about WA. You can see a lot of similarities there in a way. Those tensions between the regional and the national and how they've played out in different areas. I'm already thinking, we should do a book.
Yes.
So, I just wanted to say thanks. Yeah, it was lovely.
Thanks for that, Janine. Steve, I think we have a question or comment.
Yeah, hi. I like Jamie. I'm in the British Isles at the moment. So as a child, actually, I was brought up in Bristol, where in my house the independent TV aerial centred on the Mendip transmitter that you mentioned. So we received all of our programmes in English. My next door neighbours was directed at Wenvo in Wales. And so we could pop into their house and watch exotic things like the Eisteddfod in Welsh. It was really terribly exotic as children. I'm a PhD student, part-time PhD student in my third year at Oxford. And I'm looking at radio history and the BBC and efforts by the BBC in the 1930s to shore up a sense of Britishness in the British Empire, particularly through the Empire Service. I'm particularly interested in the experience of listeners in Australia and New Zealand, but that's a little further. That research is further down the line. But I was wondering whether or not the arrival of broadcasting then, Jamie, enhanced or detracted from a sense of shared British identity in Welsh-speaking Wales.
That's I think it's a good question. John Davis, who you may have come across, who's written the wonderful volume on the history of broadcasting in the BBC in Wales, says that everything that came after the concessions that came to, I can't remember the phrase, Welsh nationhood after broadcast, or came after broadcasting and due to broadcasting, that it was broadcasting that created that sense of a nation. I think in Welsh-speaking Wales, I think that there were, and this goes back to Aled Jones's quote, that the broadcasting in the right hands almost could be seen as something positive and create that sense of the Welsh nation. And what's interesting is when you, so it's a very waffly answer, but when you come to 1960s, where you have ITV, commercial television, coming out, which is anathema to a lot of Welsh nationalists and cultural and political nationalists, you see Gwynfor Evans, who was the president of the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, actually becoming a member of the board of directors of an ITV company, commercial company. Many people thought, he set his soul at the altar of Mammon, and there was a lot of, but it was ITV being in the right hands. Those right hands, so-called, being people who were Welsh patriots, nationalists, call them what you will. And I think broadcasting from the Welsh language perspective helps. I mean, it's an interesting tension. On the one hand, you've got the idea of Anglicisation, that everything coming from the BBC will destroy Welsh language and culture. It's really interesting because even looking at some students' essays today, Welsh language students' essays today, that concern, that fear, that narrative, that I suppose is still there, but getting actually empirical evidence for that is almost impossible. But there's that feeling that the radio comes into the living room, then there's this. Again, it was Gwynfor Evans, Ton o Saesnigrwydd, these waves of Englishness and Anglicization coming to people's rooms. It would destroy. However, I think Tom Hajowski, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, on a book on broadcasting and national identity in Britain, talks about the BBC actually supporting culture in the nations, in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and promoting the Welsh language. And I think, if you drill down a little bit into the radio time, okay, there's more there than actually more Welsh language programme. There's the BBC supported Welsh language culture. The nationalist Eisteddfod you mentioned already there, and it does that very well, I think. And I've now gone on a complete tangent and lost track of the sense of the question. But coming back to your question, I think for Welsh language, I think it I was going to say drives a wedge. It doesn't quite do that, but it shows the possibilities that Wales is a separate nation, that it has its own language and culture. But you keep coming right. I think then you have the problematic issue, of course, that around 80% of the population of Wales don't speak Welsh. Therefore, tying the language. I mean, my own father's from Tottenham in London, and yet he's been in Wales for about 50 years, went to university in Bangor University. He considers himself a Welshman now, but he doesn't speak Welsh. I do, because I went through the Welsh medium education system. So we could open a whole thing here of what it is to be Welsh, which I won't, because I know this is the last paper of the day. But if I was there, then we could pop to the pub and we could gladly. I'd love to have at some point, Steve, have more of a conversation with you, because your research is fascinating, and I think as well, my other interest being in early television. I think when television comes in the 30s and ties into those ideas of what it is to be British. So sorry, Steve and Bridget, that's a very long-winded answer to a fascinating question, but I think broadcasting does, the people see the potential of, and this is why from the 20s and 30s there are calls for for Wales to have its own broadcasting corporation, split away from the BBC, and eventually in the 1980s, of course, we have S4C, the Welsh Language Channel.
I know, almost time for the pub, Jamie, and I have to say some of us would very much like to join you in the beautiful Aberystwyth, where I have been fortunate enough to be shown around by David Hendy and spoken at the university, and also visited the National Library. Look, we can go slightly over if anyone else would like to ask anything or make any comment. Jamie, I might just suggest at this point, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
We could just have a moment to actually see the Brady Bunch family. in the last session of the day. Well, look, if there's no other burning questions, all right, look, I will thank you very much for that, Jamie, and I think it's something that Janine and I are actually going to talk a little bit about further, because there's a sort of quite an interesting connection, as Janine indicated, to something that I was talking about today in terms of the state of Western Australia and its sort of exceptionalism within the ABC's history, and you know, perhaps there is something more to tease out in relation to regionalism and public service broadcasters.
Absolutely.
And we could also, I think about questions of language as well. Obviously, that's not something that relates to the ABC really, but in terms of Wales, and also in terms of some other Commonwealth broadcasters like or sites such as India and also South Africa. So
Canada, yes, of course, the French, that's right. Yes.
Brilliant, that's fascinating.
Thanks for that, Janine. All right, I'll just quickly check the chat. Oh yes, Mark has said at the end of the day the technology has decided to fail for him, so we couldn't hear the convener. All right, look, thank you all very much for attending this. Jamie, thank you so much. If any, you're welcome to unmute yourselves and
thank you, Bridget, for sharing.
Thank you. Great. Cheers now.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.